All right, guys, these notes are covering chapter 4, section 1. It's about genetics and like the intro to that and Mendel's work. So you should have a copy of your chapter 4, section 1 notes, and we will get started filling those out. So, looking at this picture, we're just kind of making some observations right now. You can see the kitten, and you can see what the mother cat looked like. Obviously, we're not in class, but you can see that they have, a similar nose. Um, we could also infer, based on what we know about cats, that they have ears. Maybe they have similar markings because you can see some stripes. Um, but then the question is, what do you think the kitten's father might look like? And based on the fact that the mother's a dark color and the kitten is like that orange yellow color, we would probably say the father was also like an orange or yellow cat. So that kitten got its traits and similar features from its father, but it also got some from its mother. So that's what we're going to look at. So Gregor Mendel is a priest, or was a priest, in the mid 19th century. And what he did, he experimented in a garden with different types of pea plants. And through these experiments, and then other scientists taking his information and continuing the study, he revolutionized and created this whole new way that we study heredity. So, heredity is defined as the passing of physical characteristics from parents to offspring. And so, one of the things that Mendel wondered was how different pea plants have these different characteristics. If they were all, a pea plant, shouldn't they all be the same? But some of the pea plants grew really tall, others were short. Some had green seeds, others had yellow seeds, and even in our textbook, it showed how like the seeds had different textures and shapes, all of that. So those different characteristics, specifically like different physical characteristics that we can see, such as stem height or seed color, are called a trait. So Mendel observed that the pea plant's traits were often similar to those of their parents. Sometimes, however, the plants had different traits from those of their parents. So that's where Mendel and his studies and experiments helped determine um, genetics, which is that scientific study of heredity, and how those traits can be different and how they're passed from parent to offspring. So, with Mendel's experiments, he looked at flowers and their different components. So, the flower's petals surround the different components of the flower, which are the pistil and the stamens. So, the pistil is what produces the female sex cells or the eggs, and then the stamen is what produces pollen, which contains male sex cells or the sperm. And that helps the plants then pollinate, self pollinate, and continue to grow. So, a new organism begins to form when an egg and a sperm join in the process called fertilization. But for plants, before fertilization can happen in these pea plants, pollen has to reach the pistil of the pea flower. So, this process is called pollination. It's where that pollen is transferred to the other part of the flower. So, pea plants are usually self pollinating. When you plant them close together, the flowers will bloom, and like some of the pollen will fall off with like wind, or animals transfer the pollen, which is why bees are so important as well because they help pollinate plants. But in self pollination, the pollen from a flower lands on the pistil of the same flower, which is part of the same plant then. So, what Mendel did through his experiments is he developed a method by which he cross pollinated or crossed pea plants. So, he removed pollen from the flower on one plant and then he brushed that pollen onto a flower of a second plant. So, instead of it all being on the same plant, he mixed two plants. So Mendel crossed purebred tall-stemmed plants with purebred short-stemmed plants. And then the first generation of offspring all had tall plants or tall stems. So he then allowed that first generation of plants to self-pollinate. He didn't do anything. Um, and the result that he got was about 75% of the offspring having tall stems and 25% having short stems. So then the F1 generation, or that first generation of offspring, he again allowed those to self-pollinate. And then the F2, or what they say is the second filial generation, they were a mix of tall and short plants. So that shortness trait had reappeared even though none of those first generation parent plants were short. They had all been tall. But now in their second generation, they were short again. So through this, Mendel counted the tall and short plants, and about 3/4 or 75% of those plants were tall, and 1/4 or 25% was short. So as you can see in this diagram, he started with that tall and that short plant. The first generation produced all tall plants, but then that second generation produced tall and short plants again, just like the original parent generation. So Mendel didn't just do this with stem height. He looked at other characteristics in pea plants and those different contrasting traits. So in all of Mendel's crosses, only one form of the trait appeared in that first generation, but then when that second generation was pollinated and grew, that lost form of the trait always reappeared in about 1/4 of the plants. So that like recessive or that individual trait um, came back. So this has to do then with dominant and recessive alleles. So some of his conclusions, he reasoned that individual factors or sets of genetic information must control the inheritance of traits in peas. So the factor that then controls each trait exists in pairs. The female parent contributes one factor, while the male parent contributes the other factor. And so then it kind of determines what the offspring is going to look like. And another conclusion he had is that one factor in a pair can mask or hide, or what we could say like cover up, the other factor. So the tallness factor in pea plants masked the shortness factor. So today, scientists use the word gene for the factors that control a trait. And then there are alleles, which are different forms of a gene. So the gene that controls stem height in peas, for example, might have one allele for tall stems and one allele for short stems, but it's going to show up as tall. Each pea plant inherits two alleles from its parents, one allele from the egg, which would come from mom, and one allele from the sperm, which comes from dad. So other examples could be that a pea plant may inherit two alleles for tall stems. It could inherit two alleles for short stems, or it could inherit one of each, which is what we would call a hybrid. So an organism's traits are controlled by the alleles it inherits from its parents. So some of these alleles are dominant while others are recessive. So that dominant allele is that one whose trait always shows up in the organism when that allele is present. So this is the one that like masks or hide that other factor. And then a recessive allele is the one that's hidden whenever a dominant allele is present. So traits controlled by a recessive allele only show up if the organism doesn't have a dominant allele. So that's why with the original pea plants, they had the tall stems and then the short stems, which is recessive. The original or the first generation were all tall because that dominant allele masked those recessive alleles. But then with the second generation of offspring, that short allele was able to show up again. So these were some other characteristics that Mendel looked at with pea plants, and then it just kind of shows which ones were dominant, which ones were recessive, or those are those traits that maybe aren't as like favored. So in Mendel's crosses for the stem height, the purebred tall plants in the pea or that parent generation had the two alleles for tall stems, and the purebred short had two alleles for the short stems. The F1 plants, or that first set of offspring then, each inherited an allele for tall stems and an allele for short stems. So like I said, they have one of each, so they're a mix or they're called hybrid. So a hybrid organism has two different alleles for a trait. Um, and then all of that first generation plants were tall because that dominant allele is what mask or cover up that recessive allele for the short stem. But then once all of those F1 plants self-pollinated, those alleles again get transferred. But remember, they're all hybrids. So some of that second generation inherited two dominant alleles. So those plants were tall. Other offspring of that F2 inherited one dominant and one recessive allele, but those plants were still tall because of that dominant allele. And then the rest of the generation inherited two recessive alleles, which is where that short plant factor comes back into play. So, same thing can be um, determined and looked at with other characteristics, so like black fur and white fur. So in rabbits, the allele for black fur is dominant over the allele for white fur. Okay, so we could say that this black rabbit would probably have two dominant alleles, or it could even have a dominant and recessive allele, whereas this white rabbit would have to have two recessive alleles. Right, so geneticists use letters to represent these alleles. So a dominant allele is represented by a capital letter. So, for example, the allele for tall stems is represented by a capital T. So that kind of represents tall. And generally, we try to use letters that go along with the trait we're looking at. And then a recessive allele is represented by the lowercase version of that same letter. So we wouldn't change the letter we're using. We're still going to use a T, but this time it's a lowercase t. So when a plant inherits two dominant alleles for the tall stems, it's going to have two capital T's. Then, when a plant inherits two recessive alleles, it's going to have two lowercase t's. But then when a plant inherits one allele for tall stems and one allele for short stems, it's written as a capital T, lowercase t. And that dominant allele always goes first because that's how we read it, and that just shows us which one is in charge. So significant contributions to heredity are credited to Mendel through his discovery of these genes and alleles, and it helped change scientists' ideas and understanding about heredity and how traits and characteristics are passed on from parents to offspring. So Mendel showed and demonstrated that parents' traits don't just simply blend into the offspring. Instead, specific traits are determined by the individual, and you get separate alleles from each parent. So the unfortunate thing is that Mendel made all these discoveries, but it didn't get recognized while he was living. So in the early 1900, there were three different scientists that rediscovered his work, and were able to look back at it and study it even more and build upon it. And so he's now known as the father of genetics. So once you guys have these notes done, this is the end of section 4.1. I know that was a lot to take in, but it just gives you that brief overview of genes and alleles and how we start to piece them together. And it's dominant recessive alleles as well. So once you are finished with these notes, if you have to go back into the video, please do that.